Welcome to Then and Now, brought to you by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We are dedicated to studying change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every week, we interview thought leaders, historians, researchers, and policymakers about what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to Then and Now, a new podcast sponsored by the Luskin Center for History and Policy at UCLA. I'm David Myers. I teach in the UCLA Department of History and direct the Luskin Center. Our goal is to bring the past into conversation with the present, and in doing so, to understand how we got where we are so that we can imagine alternative and better futures. Our guest today is Professor Robin Kelley, the Gary B. Nash Distinguished Professor of American History and Professor of African American Studies at UCLA. Robin Kelley is a widely acclaimed author, an inspiring teacher, a deeply committed activist, and one of the most important intellectuals in the United States. Welcome to you, Robin.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here with you.
Oh, really? It's an obligation and pleasure. Obligation because of the situation we find ourselves in this country, a time of chaos and great distress, especially in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota by Derek Chauvin, a police officer with the Minneapolis Police Department on May 25th. While the status quo seems unsustainable, the state of affairs also evokes the French expression that the more things change, the more they stay the same. We recognize this movie. Another innocent African-American murdered, another police officer responsible. Will justice be served? Many people, African Americans and others, fear that the answer is no. And there are really few people more suited to address the questions that arise from the current moment than Robin Kelley. So, Robin, when we first talked about having this conversation last week, you brought up the famous concept of the German Jewish thinker Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil. To remind our listeners, that was the term that Arendt used while reporting on the trial in 1961 of SS officer for Jewish affairs Adolf Eichmann, who was apprehended by Israeli officers in Argentina and brought to Israel to face justice for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against the Jewish people. Arendt, very controversially, saw Eichmann not as a monstrous demon in his own right, but rather as a cog in the wheel, a bureaucrat simply following the orders of a demonic regime and leader. And I'm wondering, Robin, why in the wake of the convulsive events of the last week or so, you thought of Arendt's concept? And more generally, how do you think that idea has held up since the appearance of Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, in 1963?
That's a great question. I returned to the book for some other reason, and I was struck by how her formulation of the banality of evil, and especially the idea of bureaucratic nobodies, really helped me think about the routine nature of racist police violence. So, imagine, I'm 58 years old. My entire life, all I remember are, Black people being killed by the police. I could name names going back to 1970s. And I've watched this, and I've watched Black people die at the hands of the police in staggering numbers. And in every instance, when protests occur, we're always looking for monsters. The bad apples, the Klansmen with a badge, and this leads actually and continues to lead to policies that focus on officer behavior. That is, you fire officers that are bad, you train officers to make them better, you diversify the force. But these guys are quite literally doing their job. And when you see that video of Derek Chauvin, rocking on George Floyd's neck, and his hands are in his pocket, right? He doesn't think he's doing anything wrong. This is broad daylight. And the same goes for the men who invaded the home of Breonna Taylor, who killed Michael Brown, Tamir Rice. They were not necessarily monsters. They didn't wake up in the morning with hate in their heart. They were much closer to what Hannah Arendt calls nobodies. That is, they were employees of the state who believed they were doing their jobs, Um, but the difference is, and here is where I probably differ with Hannah Arendt, maybe just in terms of emphasis, is that while they didn't wake up with hatred in their hearts, they were operatives of a system that understood and organized the world by differentiating groups into suspects and criminals, victims, and then those who are to be protected or those who need protection. Their job was to defend property. Their job is to defend property against people without property, and the axis often falls along the counterfeit lines of race. So lethal weapons are used to preserve life. Lethal weapons are, we're told, are the things that they need to save their lives, to save the lives of others, not to kill. Killing is saving life. Killing the disposable, that is those considered disposable by the state, even if there is no law or rule, it's kind of, there's a kind of consistency in terms of the acquittals of officers in these cases. They're almost all, 99% of police officers involved in homicides are not charged with anything, and 1% that are charged are usually not charged with murder. And they almost never get convicted. So one last thing about this, this is why, two things. This is why I really like, Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism. She says racism is, racism specifically is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So in this definition, there's no classic binary between evil and good, between the monsters and the good people, no bad apples. And in some ways, what's critical is the sense that the society we live in is steeped in white supremacy. So yes, it is true. Eichmann was a cog in the wheel. But where I think Hannah Arendt might have faltered, and maybe I misread her, is underestimating the extent to which Nazi ideology dominated everyday thought. To the extent that, so many Germans were seeped in it. It became common sense, much like white supremacy is a kind of common sense. It's not just a structure upon high, but a common sense that really, in some ways, regulates or guides people's behavior. And one of the most amazing things we're seeing with these protests are people who are rejecting the common sense. A lot of white people rejecting the common sense of white supremacy and doing things that are not necessarily what they're expected to do.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in what you've just offered. I want to just drill down, if I can, on a couple of points, and that is the idea of the erasure of the distinction between evil and good because the state dictates it. And this is an insight that Arendt and a number of other often German thinkers arrived at in the middle of the century as they looked on the specter of totalitarianism and fascism, that the state, by definition of being the ultimate authority, had its own instrumental logic, to use the terms of Horkheimer and Adorno, that basically made might right, made bad good, made evil into virtue. And indeed, that is a critique that we have to think of in the current context. And I want to talk more about that. But if I could just go back to one piece of the Arendt story that's important. As you know well, she was criticized for depicting Eichmann as a cog in the wheel, which her critics saw as an erasure of his own culpability. And I'm just curious to hear how you address that criticism in the context of Derek Chauvin. How are we to understand that individual's culpability, mindful of the fact that he is an agent of the state? But are we to forget about that or turn our attention away from the individual's culpability?
I think you could do both. I mean, I read Arendt a little differently. I thought that in the end, she wasn't so much erasing Eichmann's culpability entirely, and I understand the critique, but that the culpability didn't rest on his shoulders. In other words, structural racism also involves culpable people, and that in fact, one of the slogans that you see on the streets is, white silence is complicity, right? And
white silence is violence.
Is violence, yeah. Right? White silence is violence. White silence is complicity. And if that's the case, then instead of removing culpability or transferring it to this powerful state, it then redounds upon everyone that we're all culpable in some way. We're all, have a sense of responsibility. And so again, I'm thinking about this in terms of U.S. history and especially white supremacy. My dear friend Nola Ignatieff, who passed away recently, was the editor of a journal called Race Trader, and the masthead on Race Trader was, loyalty to treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity. And his thing is that every person needs to basically reject, what whiteness stands for, in terms of like an exercise of power, privilege. It's not to deny one's own self, but to recognize that there's an identity that's tied to the reproduction of racism. And so in some respects, that's where I might differ. I don't know. Hannah Arendt is not here to argue with me or you, but I do think that those two things are synergistic. There would be no, and this is the thing that's most important in terms of my reading of that text, is that Derek Chauvin had some like 26 complaints filed against him. The department, the police department in Minneapolis, I think between 2003 and maybe 2016, I believe those are the dates, but roughly had to pay out $21 million in settlements for lawsuits and claims for police misconduct and wrongful death. In other words, that system that takes money from people, taxpayers, doesn't hold the officers accountable, and then use taxpayers' money to pay out what we can argue are not just police misconduct, but acts of white supremacy or racism or violence against working people, violence against women. That alone suggests that they're being moved forward in this not just as a cog, but as a facilitator of a system, and that system continues to facilitate and reward this genocidal behavior.
Right. Well, I think your instinct is right here. I think Arendt did not understand this as a zero-sum proposition. She in fact thought Eichmann should be convicted. While at the same time, she believed that the real attention must be focused on the structure of hatred and violence that Nazism represented, and understanding the ultimate source. And that brings us to the current moment. And I'm interested to hear how you understand this current moment. Many people have suggested that this current moment can be compared to other moments in the not too distant past, to 1992, especially here in Los Angeles, the year of the Rodney King beating and the acquittal of the police officers who beat him and the subsequent uprising, or even further back to 1968, or even to 1965 and Watts. I'm just wondering how you think about such analogies, both in general and in a more particular sense to those years that I mentioned. How should we understand this current moment? Is it a rupture, an opening, directly analogous to past moments, and thus destined to repeat the cycle?
Well, I think that there are patterns, some things that are, I wouldn't say repeated, but certainly continue to prevail. Like, for example, the Watts Rebellion, 1992, and now all center, again, on some act of police violence. I mean, that's just consistent. And it centers on some acts of police violence that ultimately had national implications, in fact, international implications. I mean, Watts and the LA Rebellion all had these international ramifications. So that's consistent, but I think there's some significant differences. You know, Watts in 65 was pretty much contained to South Los Angeles. It was considered to be a Black revolt against the police and the state. Now, you know, there are other people who are involved, but one thing about Watts, which is so interesting, is that out of the ashes of Watts emerged this amazing kind of cultural and political renaissance, a political movement that led to, you know, Community Alert Patrol and the Black Panther Party and US organization, and just a lot of sort of cultural nationalism flowering. 1992, which extended beyond South LA, started there, then it went out, which shocked everybody. And in both cases, the National Guard were involved. In 1992, it's interesting just how I wouldn't say how violent, but just how widespread that rebellion was and how many people died. I mean, I think someone was telling me that it took, before the National Guard was called in, I think some 60 odd people were already killed. And though that was a kind of rebellion in which, you know, 65 people were pretty organized. 92, there was some organization, but people were caught off guard. You know, they didn't know what to do. In fact, organization emerged out of 1992, which led to the great gang truce and a plan for Los Angeles. And, you know, the other differences between the two is 65 is the Lyndon Johnson administration. It's a liberal administration. It is one that is insisting on trying to attend to the poor through a war on poverty, attend to racism and inequality. 65 also was, in some ways, a catalyst for a range of protests between 63 Cambridge, 63 and 72, where 300 cities went up in flames, 60,000 people arrested. It was like a war zone. 92, I wouldn't say 92 was isolated, but 92 was very significant and very much focused on Los Angeles. Now, when we jump to today, I think there is a very significant difference. It's something I've never seen in my lifetime, and that is the crowds, the protesters are far more multiracial than I've ever seen. And I lived through 92. I lived through Harlem in 64. That's how old I am. But you know, these are multiracial crowds. It's affecting 40 cities at least, plus outside the United States, France, in Netherlands, Germany, South Africa, everywhere. This seems to be a movement that also has a much clearer sense of what to do. And when I say movement, I know we're going to get into this a little later, but there are significant organizational forces with an agenda that organize a lot of these protests. And we don't always see that agenda because there's so much focus on looting. But part of that agenda is an agenda that 10 years ago, 5 years ago, was seen as completely fantasy. And that is defund the police, replace police with new forms of public safety, decarceration. I mean, things that people weren't talking about before. But this comes out of, and this is, I think, significant, the reason that we can have this vast multiracial presence in cities all over the country, and also an insistent movement that doesn't seem to be letting up, making demands that just seem like not just reformist demands, but demands that are structural reforms. That the reason that this happens is because we had a decade of almost a decade of intense struggle, beginning with the Trayvon Martin killing, all the way through Eric Garner and Michael Brown, and that these were not just lists of names of people killed by the police. This also generated a massive movement across the country that was already prepared and mobilized to do this despite a pandemic. So these times are different. These times are and one last thing is that even though a lot of what happened under President Obama's watch, I'm not blaming him or anything, but we have to remember that. One of the things that's significant is that the whole time Obama was president, he never recognized Black Lives Matter as an organization. Now that he's no longer in office, he's actually praising them and saying, we need to support them. That's a sea change. No one expected. So these different times.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious about that 10-year period that you're talking about, beginning with the Trayvon Martin murder, and then including the Obama years. I'm curious, before we get to the current moment and the Trump regime, how do you assess the Obama presidency in terms of that decade and the changes that took place during it?
That's why this is being podcast, right? Okay. Yeah, I have to tell the truth. So I like Obama as a person. I met him once, actually, Martha's Vineyard. His family's wonderful. Michelle is great. But when it comes to his record with respect to policing, it's certainly not Trump's. No, there's no comparison. But it was less than what many of us expected. And I'll say why. There are sort of two or three things that I think characterize his administration. One is, he had a deep empathy for the people who were being killed. I mean, his remarks about Trayvon Martin could have been his son. I mean, that's very moving and powerful. But at the same time, he continued to support legislation that would use federal funds to purchase or transfer military hardware to local police forces. So there wasn't a major reform there. He still held on to the idea that, the police just simply need to be better trained, but they also need to be better equipped. When the uprising in Baltimore took place after the murder of Freddie Gray, Obama was quoted as saying, that those protests were not the protests, but the riots were really a bunch of thugs. So in other words, he was using thugs before Trump, although I can't think of a president who didn't use thugs, not in the 20th century, at least. So at some point it happens. I think toward the end of his administration, things began to change. But all I know is that Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black lives, groups like Recharge Genocide, the Dream Defenders, have fought tirelessly against the Obama administration. And they said, look, we appreciate the Justice Department deciding to investigate cases like the murder of Michael Brown and others, but they wanted some more significant reforms. So they weren't crazy about what was going on. And now a lot of them feel vindicated. I mean, these are friends of mine, people who run these organizations. They feel quite vindicated because of Obama's change in heart, but also recognizing that the movements that erupted would have forced anyone to have a change of heart who's a Democrat, given what's going on.
So for many observers, including many good liberals, it often seems like the big rupture came with the election of Donald Trump and his blatant disregard for the rule of law, his unvarnished rhetoric of vilification, amongst other offenses. How should we understand Trump's presidency in the context of this moment of change?
Right. That's an excellent question because, I spent the last 5, 6, 7 years writing all these pieces in the Obama years, critical Obama, but there's a fundamental difference. Fundamental difference. When Obama was president, at all stages of his administration, including the Department of Education, there was a tendency to yield to pressure. In other words, a great example, of course, is like, Obama's position on the pipeline, and recognizing that fossil fuels, are not the path of the future. A lot of pressure was put on Obama and others. Trump is not only unyielding, but he and his people have a particular agenda that does not respond to democratic pressures whatsoever. If anything, and I know this is a word that people don't like to use very often, but if there's ever a regime in the United States that's close to fascism, this is the one. And the reason why is that the Trump administration, I say the administration, not just him, because I think he's kind of an idiot, but everyone in that administration they're quick to invoke a kind of state of emergency, kind of state of exception, to do anything they want. If that means the most recent iteration of that, of course, is deploying the army against protesters, right? Declaring, organizations like Antifa, which stands for anti-fascist, saying that anti-fascists are terrorists. Pushing through, using money that's earmarked for the Pentagon to build a wall. There's so many things that just have no relationship to the rule of law. Mm-hmm. The way that this administration tries to kind of run over even the judiciary by appointing judges who are not only unqualified, but doing so in the dark of night. This is what's dangerous. And I think what's going to happen, and one of the differences is that that protest, opposition, instead of forcing an administration to yield, it would lead to greater repression, justification for imprisonment, deportation, and anyone who's engaged in creating alternatives to the current state, with changing the law, like eliminating cash bail, pushing to stop prison construction, all that, they're going to be crushed, totally crushed. And the fact that, this is almost like a science fiction novel. The fact that Donald Trump is basically his antagonists are governors and mayors. It's not even like, they're like all these socialists out there, or anarchists, no, his antagonists are governors and mayors who are trying to push back against this regime. That is dangerous, and that's where I think it's radically different from Obama, even if in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy, there may be some similarities. But, look, we're historians. We know that there's been a pretty standard pattern of domestic and foreign policy initiatives going back to the 1970s to today, irrespective of party. But this Trump is different. It's different.
And now the added cover of the COVID crisis, which enables the invocation of emergency law, state of emergency, with the greatest of ease. So you have these two factors laying on top of one another: Trump and his disregard for the rule of law and vilification strategies, and the COVID crisis. And I'm wondering if, with your good Marxian training, you see the potential for the dialectics of history to come into play. That is to say, this exacerbation of oppression offering up the prospect of a redemptive moment.
Yeah, well, the prospect, see, that's the key word, prospect of a redemptive moment. I do think that the prospect is there. But whether or not it could be realized is a matter of a number of things. It rests on recognizing, I think, several things. One, that even the COVID crisis, the pandemic, kind of lays bare other contradictions that have been dogging our society for a long time. I mean, it becomes a pretext for Trump's agenda, but some of that agenda are tied to older draconian policies. So the acceleration of border closings, for example, and more barriers to asylum seekers. We saw that. It's more intense under Trump, but we saw that as basically American history since the 1970s, since 1977 especially, ignoring or limiting labor laws in retail and warehouse workers, who work for Amazon and for Instacart and all these gig workers who are quite precarious and who are fighting for a minimum wage. The what I think is just a vicious assault on the meatpacking industry, where people are dying, their infection rates rise exponentially. The conditions for work and the decline of wages, the elimination of those labor laws, that accelerated under Trump, but that was going on, again, since the 70s. Indian country, which is the latest, epicenter of the coronavirus, it's years, decades, century of federal government's continued legacy of neglect and dispossession and enclosure, which creates the conditions for there being no infrastructure, for there being the spread of COVID-19. So if there's going to be a redemptive moment, it has to be one that is not centered on the elimination of Donald Trump and then walking away to try to get to business as usual. Because my biggest fear, is that people will come to believe that all we need is a Democrat in the White House, and then we can go back to normal. But what was normal wasn't so great. And then just three other things I would mention, which I think are telling about this time. One is that even the kind of the anti-Asian racism that was provoked by the myth of the Chinese virus, that anti-Asian racism preceded Trump, and preceded Trump, as we know, a long, long, long way. Domestic violence spiked.
Deep roots in American history.
Oh yeah, domestic violence especially is something we don't talk much about. Really spiked under the sort of stay-at-home orders, and there was basically all these people who had to either choose homelessness or live under terror because there were no resources available to them. As a result, domestic violence was an issue way before Trump was elected, and it hasn't gotten much better. And then finally, mass incarceration is such a great example where jails and prisons, which we witnessed, especially in the state of California, where, our great friend, Governor Brown, who now is sort of supporting decarceration, oversaw one of the biggest prison construction periods in California history. And so now people are talking about for the first time, we need to decarcerate. This is not humane. I think it's a very powerful redemptive possibility. But it's up against a force that says we not only need more prisons, but we need to lock people up forever. I mean, that's what we're up against. So I don't know what the future holds. In these instances, this is when I turn to Walter Benjamin and to Pierre Naville, who was the great French surrealist, who both of whom really believe that in a kind of revolutionary pessimism. The idea that you have to you can't assume things are going to be better. You can't assume that you're going to vote in the progressive regime through social democracy. You can't assume that the Soviet experiment is just like on a path to greatness. They're like, no, that's not happening. What we can do is fight against a catastrophe, knowing things are terrible. And that revolutionary pessimism is the one that I embrace.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you, what do you hold on to now, and what do you counsel that others hold on to? Is it hope in the redemptive possibilities of the dialectics of history, or is it remaining immersed in the despair of the moment and the ugliness, the confrontation with the ugliness of this deeply rooted racism that has defined the United States in its history? Because that um, that can be immobilizing, or it can be animating. And I wonder how you think at this point about. You touched upon it, but I'll ask you more directly. How do you think about the possibility to uh, build upon this moment to really begin to uproot the foundations of racial injustice in this country?
Mm.
Do we have it within us to do it? And then I want to ask you specifically, what does it look like? And you already began to reveal some of the important new policies that would have to be part of that more just world.
Right. Well, David, this is the question that keeps me up at night. I mean, besides my children, but I wish I had an easy answer. In fact, I went back and rediscovered and reread Pierre Naville precisely because I don't have an answer to this question. Especially being in Black studies, one of the things we're confronted with is a kind of new tendency, an intellectual tendency known as Afro-pessimism, which is not the old Afro-pessimism, which was based on the idea that Africa has no future, but a new Afro-pessimism based on the idea that anti-Black racism structures the entire universe, basically, and that is the main axis of antagonism in the world. And so we have to sort of accept that, and that the only way to get rid of it is to essentially the destruction of a whole system. And I don't buy the idea that anti-Black racism structures all of Western civilization or all of the globe. I think it's more complicated than that. I do think race does, but race also is not always tied to skin color. But that's another debate. What I do think, though, is that we have to hold on to both of these things simultaneously. That is, we can never forget the depth of racial violence, gendered violence, of class violence, of a world that continues to deny people the basic humanity, let alone resources to be able to live the next day. We can't forget that, because we can't forget it in the way that we continue to imagine a new future or dream or whatever you want to call it. Those things we have to stay wide awake and be in the midst of them, and also come up with things that could relieve those conditions. That is reform. I mean, there are people, I have friends who are like, well, you never could do anything about those things, so therefore you need a revolution. If there's no revolution, don't call me. Well, that's not how the world works. People are dying. People on the streets are dying. So we have to always be vigilant about the catastrophes, both trying to be a salve and try to sort of intervene, but also look at the long picture. And so I do think that I do look for hope, but hope is not something that is pie in the sky. Hope is the recognition of solidarity. And that when I see people moving from positions toward a kind of river demanding justice, who are also willing to yield with that river and recognize that the definitions of justice are not fixed. The definition of liberation not fixed, that we have to keep changing and moving together. that kind of solidarity, that's the source of hope for me. It's not about winning. We're not going to win anything, but it's about moving, and moving the discourse and moving the way we think, moving our common sense so that white supremacy, a world governed by commodities and wealth accumulation, inequality, patriarchy, that these things are not common sense. This is not just a natural way of the world, but they're unnatural and have to be dislodged. And that's how I see it, and that's how I move in the world,
And in that regard, how do you read today Dr. King's belief that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice?
My position on that is that it doesn't bend toward justice. I think that if King were sitting next to me right now, my guess is that he'd agree with me when I say that we bend it, that the people bend it, that there's no necessary natural arc, that there's no guarantee, because that's kind of teleological understanding of history. Like, we know we're going to get there. And this is Obama. He does the same thing. We know we're going to get, because we just follow that arc and we'll get there. But we have to keep bending it in the same way that Simon Bodilla bent those steel rods to make the Watts Towers. We have to bend, and sometimes they snap and break in our face. Sometimes they bend in ways that we then don't recognize what justice is. And I think that we have to continue to be vigilant about even defining what justice is, because I don't think it's always fixed, And I don't think it's individual. I think these are the collective conversations we have to have all together. But I do think one thing that I think King and I would definitely agree on is that in trying to bend that arc, I think he's absolutely right about the meaning of the kind of political love that he talks about, which is agape, which is this constant struggle to make community. And that, no matter how many times I might feel seduced by the claims of Afro-pessimists, I also know that in the end, making communities is hard thing that will require all of us. And if you really believe that, then you believe in abolition. And so this is going to sound strange. I think that I'm not pushing for jail time for anybody. I don't think anyone should be jailed or executed or banned, but rather the struggle to make community is to try to figure out how to get those people who were nobodies, who were cogs in this administrative wheel, to find their humanity within solidarity with others, to try to destroy this machine and build something that's much more humane.
Which brings us back, of course, to the banality of evil and Hannah Arendt's concept. And you've articulated, if I've understood you correctly, a kind of theory of history according to which we have constancy of change, we have a measure of human agency, but serious structural constraints placed upon it. And in a certain sense, that's the hand we're dealt with. That's what leads to redemptive pessimism, Afro-pessimism. But it is not a mandate to stay static. It requires constant movement.
Right.
So maybe as just the final question, and we thank you because we know this is such a busy and troubling and troubled time for you and for all of us. I can ask, what do you think the role of the historian is in the pursuit of justice? And how have you understood your vocation as an historian, as an instrument in your own pursuit of justice?
Dang, you come up with such hard questions. But that's why you're so brilliant. So I have a very simple answer, actually, now I think about it. There was one of my heroes in the kind of African liberation movement was an intellectual activist, writer, leader of the revolutionary movement in Guinea-Bissau, and his name is Amilcar Cabral. And he had this slogan, not just a slogan, but he used to say frequently, tell no lies, claim no easy victories. And I think, I try to train my own students and teach my own students that, we can't be afraid of the evidence that contradicts everything we believe. And I'm not saying that, I'm not making a case for empiricism. I'm saying that we have to pursue as much of something we can think of as the truth as possible. That is, dig deep into and challenge the assumptions that we bring to bear on our material, even if it means studying the things that we don't feel comfortable studying, examining the questions that we don't feel comfortable examining, being prepared to change our position, based on what we discover and how we think about it. And don't use the platform we have as historians as ways to do agitprop, propaganda work. I mean, I'm not against agitprop. I do that stuff, but there's a difference in that and actual scholarship, and scholarship matters. It really does matter. The most, and we can come back to you can end on Hannah Arendt because, even though I may not agree with a lot of things she writes, she was not afraid to say the unpopular thing, to try to go dig deeper and understand how structures work, to deal with the things that are hidden from public view. And it's the things that are hidden, the operations that we can't see, that's our job, to discover those things, reveal them. Doesn't mean that we're always right, but it means that we're not out there to make people happy or excited. We're out there to dig deep and reveal some truths that might be able to allow us some deeper insights and move forward.
Well, indeed, she was fierce in her criticism. And Robin, you too have some of that fierceness in your critical perspective, which is matched by really extraordinary scholarship. It's been a privilege to spend this time with you, Robin. I know you have other things to go to, so we will let you go get to them. But we thank you for making time to be with us on Then and Now, which is a production of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy with support from the UCLA History Department. Then and Now can be found on Spotify and Apple Podcast. Special thanks to our executive producer, Maya Ferdman. And thank you again so much, Robin Kelley.
Yeah, well, thank you. This was a pleasure. I had a lot of fun.
Thank you for joining us this week on Then and Now. Then and Now is brought to you by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy, where we study change to make change. For more on our work, follow us on Twitter and Facebook at our handle, @LuskinHistory. Our show is produced by Maya Ferdman and David Myers, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.